In the isolated hills of Appalachia, deep in the forests of eastern Kentucky, there exists a medical file that has been sealed for over 40 years. Inside that file are photographs, genetic test results, and witness testimonies about a family that should not exist according to everything we know about human biology. Between 1952 and 1979, a woman named Constance Merrow gave birth to 30 children in a decaying farmhouse 15 miles from the nearest town of Harrow Creek. All 30 children were born from relationships with her own sons and brothers, a cycle of inbreeding that spanned 3 decades. But the genetic catastrophe that scientists predicted never fully materialized. Instead, something else happened, something that doctors still whisper about in medical conferences when they think no one is listening. Every single one of those 30 children was born profoundly deaf to the outside world. They could not hear traffic, thunder, music, or the voices of strangers, but they could hear each other with perfect clarity. Not just their voices, but their thoughts, their fears, their hunger, their pain. If you're fascinated by medical mysteries that blur the line between science and the supernatural, stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you is documented in sealed court records, hidden medical files, and the terrified testimonies of social workers who entered that house only once and refused to ever return. This is the story of the Merrow family and the frequency that should not exist. The Merrow farmhouse stood at the end of a dirt road that turned to mud 6 months of the year. It was a structure that seemed to sag under its own weight, a two-story building with boarded windows and a porch that had rotted through in several places. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, and locals in Harrow Creek had learned long ago not to ask questions about the people who lived there. The family had been in those hills since before the Civil War, always keeping to themselves, always regarded with suspicion and unease. Constance Merrow was born in that house in 1932, the daughter of parents who were themselves first cousins. She never attended school, never left the property, never interacted with the outside world beyond the occasional trip to town for supplies. By the time she was 16, her father had died, and she lived alone with her mother and her 2 brothers, Samuel and Jeremiah, in that isolated farmhouse where the rules of civilization seemed not to apply. What happened in that house over the next 3 decades remains partially obscured by time and deliberate concealment, but court documents from 1979 provide a skeletal outline. Constance began having children at 17, and the father was her older brother Samuel. The first child, a boy named Ezekiel, was born in 1949 with clubfoot and a cleft palate, but was otherwise healthy. The second child, a girl named Ruth, came 2 years later, fathered by Jeremiah. The third child's father was Samuel again. This pattern continued, Constance bearing children by her brothers, and, as her sons reached adolescence, by them as well. There was no outside intervention, no doctors, no hospitals, no birth certificates. Constance delivered each child herself, with help from her mother, until the old woman died in 1967. After that, the older daughters assisted with the births. The children were named from the Bible, raised in complete isolation, and taught that the outside world was dangerous and sinful, that their family was chosen by God for a special purpose. The genetic consequences of such intensive inbreeding should have been catastrophic. Medical science tells us that children born from incestuous relationships face dramatically increased risks of birth defects, develop mental disabilities, and early death. The Merrow children exhibited some of these problems. Several had physical deformities, crooked spines, shortened limbs, facial asymmetries. 3 died in infancy from causes that were never officially recorded. But the majority survived, and as they grew, doctors who would later examine them found something that contradicted everything they expected. The children's intelligence was largely normal, their organ function adequate, their life expectancy near average. It was as if something was compensating for the genetic damage, Some mechanism that shouldn't exist was protecting them from the worst consequences of their heritage. And then there was the hearing. The first indication that something was profoundly wrong came in 1971, when a truant officer named Douglas Hickman drove out to the Merrow property to investigate why none of the children had ever been enrolled in school. Douglas was a man in his 50s, a Korean War veteran who had seen things that gave him nightmares, and he thought nothing could shock him anymore. He was wrong. When he knocked on the door of the farmhouse that September afternoon, it was opened by a teenage girl, perhaps 16, with tangled black hair and eyes that seemed too large for her thin face. She stared at him without speaking, and Douglas introduced himself, explained that he was there to discuss the children's education. The girl did not respond to his voice. She simply stared at him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Then, without turning her head, without moving her lips, she seemed to communicate with someone inside the house, and Douglas heard something that he would later describe as the most unsettling sound of his life. It wasn't a voice exactly, or rather it was a voice but wrong somehow, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. It echoed inside his head, bypassing his ears entirely, and it said in a child's tone, "Mother says you should leave now." Douglas stumbled backward, nearly falling off the rotten porch, and the girl smiled at him, a smile without warmth or humor. Douglas got back in his car and drove straight to the sheriff's office in Harrow's Creek, where he told Sheriff Raymond Walsh what he had experienced. The sheriff listened with an expression of deep unease, because the Merrow family had been a source of rumors and folktales for decades, and while no one could prove anything illegal was happening, everyone knew that something wasn't right in that house. Douglas insisted that someone needed to investigate, that there were children in that house who needed help. The sheriff made calls to the state social services department, and 3 weeks later, a team of 2 social workers and a deputy drove out to the Merrow farmhouse to conduct a welfare check. What happened during that visit was documented in a report that would later be sealed by court order. But copies exist in certain archives if you know where to look. The social workers, a woman named Patricia Holbrook and a man named James Terrence, approached the house accompanied by Deputy Michael Crenshaw. They were prepared for poverty, for neglect, perhaps for evidence of abuse. They were not prepared for what they actually found. The door was answered by Constance herself, a woman of 39 who looked 60, her face gaunt, her hair gray, her body worn out by decades of constant pregnancy and childbirth. She did not speak to them, did not acknowledge their words, but she stepped aside and allowed them to enter, and what they saw inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The interior of the farmhouse was dim, lit by kerosene lamps and candles. There was electricity. The lines had been run out to the property in the 50s, but the family rarely used it. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of unwashed bodies, mildew, spoiled food, and something else. Something organic and wrong that Patricia could not identify. In the main room, sitting on the floor, on broken furniture, standing in corners and doorways, were children and young adults. Patricia counted 19 before she stopped counting, 19 faces of various ages from infant to mid-20s, all staring at the visitors with the same unsettling intensity. None of them spoke aloud. None of them made any sound. But Patricia could feel them communicating, could sense information passing between them in ways that had nothing to do with spoken language or sign language, or any form of communication she recognized. James Terrence tried to speak to the children, asking their names, their ages, trying to establish some basic information. Not one of them responded to his voice. They did not react to sounds at all. When Deputy Crenshaw dropped his pen and it clattered on the wooden floor, none of the children turned toward the noise. When Patricia clapped her hands loudly, trying to get their attention, there was no response. The children appeared to be completely deaf, but then something happened that made all three visitors go pale. The youngest child, an infant perhaps 6 months old, began to cry. The sound came not from the baby's mouth, which remained closed, but from somewhere else, reverberating through the room, through their skulls. A wail of hunger and discomfort that bypassed their ears entirely. Immediately, an older girl, maybe 12, walked over to the infant and picked it up, and the crying stopped, and Patricia heard inside her own head a voice, the girl's voice, saying, "Hush now, Abigail, hush," even though the girl's lips had not moved. Patricia, James, and Deputy Crenshaw conducted their inspection as quickly as possible, documenting the conditions, taking notes, and trying not to show how frightened they were. The house was barely livable, with holes in the roof, broken windows covered with plastic, minimal furniture, and inadequate sanitation. The children appeared malnourished, inadequately clothed, living in conditions that clearly constituted neglect. But the strangest aspect was the communication. Patricia watched as the children interacted with each other in perfect silence, moving in coordinated ways that suggested complex exchanges of information, responding to needs and questions that had not been spoken aloud. At one point, she saw 2 of the older boys, twins perhaps, standing 15 feet apart, and she knew, though she could not explain how, that they were having a conversation. That information was passing between them in real time. Detailed information that included not just words but emotions. Sensations, shared memories. The visit lasted 90 minutes before Constance indicated that they needed to leave. She did this without speaking, simply standing by the door with an expression that conveyed absolute finality. As the 3 visitors left, Patricia turned back one last time and saw all of the children watching from windows, from the porch, from doorways. And the sensation of being observed by a single consciousness, spread across multiple bodies, was so intense that she nearly ran to the car. Deputy Crenshaw drove them back to town, and no one spoke during the drive. The silence in the car was heavy with the weight of what they had witnessed. When they finally reached the social services office, Patricia and James spent 3 hours writing their report, trying to find language to describe what they had experienced, struggling to convey the wrongness of that place in professional, clinical terms. Their report triggered an immediate response. Within a week, a judge had issued an order for the children to be removed from the home and placed in state custody. A larger team was assembled, including additional social workers, police officers, and medical personnel. They arrived at the Merrow farmhouse on October 15, 1971, prepared for resistance, bringing a doctor who could conduct preliminary health assessments and a child psychologist who specialized in trauma cases. What they found was an empty house. The Merrows were gone. All of them, Constance and all 30 children, had vanished. Their belongings were still there, their few possessions scattered throughout the house, but the family itself had disappeared into the dense forest that surrounded the property. Forest that stretched for miles in every direction. Forest so thick that search dogs got lost, and helicopters could not see through the canopy. The search lasted for 3 weeks and involved state police, volunteers from surrounding counties, and even National Guard units. They found no trace of the family. It was as if 31 people had been absorbed by the wilderness. The official conclusion was that they had likely died of exposure, that Constance in her paranoia had led her children into the forest where they had perished. But the locals knew better. The locals had heard stories for generations about the deep woods, about things that lived in caves and hollows, about sounds that came from places where no one lived. The search was eventually called off. The case was filed as unsolved, and the Merrow farmhouse was boarded up and left to decay. For 8 years it stood empty, a monument to a family that had violated natural law and paid an unknown price. Then, in 1979, something happened that reopened the case and revealed the full horror of what the Merrows had become. A group of hikers from the University of Kentucky was exploring a remote area of the forest, mapping cave systems for a geology project, when they stumbled across what they thought was an abandoned mining camp. There were crude shelters built from branches and scavenged materials, fire pits, tools made from sharpened stone and bone. The hikers were excited, thinking they had discovered evidence of early settlers, or perhaps even indigenous peoples. They began documenting the site, taking photographs, collecting samples. That's when they heard it, the sound that Douglas Hickman had described 8 years earlier. The sound that Patricia Holbrook still heard in her nightmares. It came from deeper in the forest, a voice that was many voices, a frequency that should not exist, saying clearly inside their heads, "Leave this place. You are not welcome here." The hikers, 3 young men in their 20s, froze. They looked at each other, confirming that they had all heard the same thing, that they were not hallucinating. One of them, a student named Marcus Webb, shouted into the forest, asking who was there, saying they meant no harm. The response came immediately, and this time it was not words but pure emotion. A wave of hostility and warning so intense that all 3 men felt their hearts race, felt adrenaline flood their systems, felt the primal urge to run. They did run, leaving their equipment behind, crashing through the undergrowth until they reached their vehicle. They drove straight to the nearest police station, which happened to be in Harrow's Creek, and they told Sheriff Walsh, the same sheriff who had sent investigators to the Merrow house 8 years earlier, about what they had found. The sheriff organized an expedition, and this time they brought serious resources, armed deputies, search and rescue personnel, and a doctor who specialized in feral children and isolated populations. They hiked into the forest, following the coordinates the students had provided, and they found the camp. It was larger than the students had described, a settlement of perhaps 20 structures, all built from natural materials, hidden so well that you could walk within 50 feet and never see it. And the Merrows were there, all of them, or most of them. Some had clearly died in the intervening years, but the majority had survived, had adapted to life in the wilderness with a skill that seemed impossible for people who had lived their entire lives in a house. They wore clothing made from animal hides, used tools they had crafted themselves, hunted and gathered their food. But none of that was the most shocking discovery. The most shocking discovery was the children. In the 8 years since the family had disappeared, Constance had given birth to 6 more children, bringing the total to 36. These youngest children had been born in the forest, delivered in caves or crude shelters, with no medical care beyond what their older siblings could provide. All 6 had survived. All 6 were healthy, or as healthy as could be expected given the circumstances. And all 6 exhibited the same strange deafness, the same ability to communicate with their family in ways that defied explanation. But something else had changed. The children were no longer just deaf to the outside world. They were becoming physically adapted to their isolation. The youngest ones had eyes that were larger than normal, pupils that dilated more widely, adaptations for seeing in the darkness of caves. Their hearing, when tested, showed no response to normal sound frequencies, but they reacted to frequencies far below and far above the range of human hearing, as if their auditory system had shifted to something non-human. The standoff that followed lasted for hours. The authorities wanted to bring the family out of the forest to provide medical care to assess the children's well-being, but the Merrows refused to leave. They did not refuse with words because they still did not speak aloud, still did not respond to spoken language. They refused through a coordinated silence that was somehow louder than any protest, through a collective will that pressed against the minds of everyone present. The doctor who had come to assess them, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, attempted to approach the youngest children to conduct examinations. She got within 10 feet before she stopped, overwhelmed by a sensation she would later describe as drowning, as if her mind was being flooded by too much information, too many thoughts and emotions and sensations that were not her own. She stumbled backward and told the sheriff that they needed to leave, that continuing to press would result in violence, though she could not explain how she knew this. The authorities retreated, but they left behind observation posts, and over the following weeks, they documented the Merrow family from a distance. What they observed should have been scientifically impossible. The family moved through the forest with perfect coordination, even when separated by hundreds of yards. When one found food, the others knew immediately and converged on the location. When danger approached, a black bear wandering too close to their camp, all of them responded simultaneously, retreating to safety before the threat was visible. They hunted in groups with an efficiency that suggested telepathic communication, driving game toward concealed family members who struck at precisely the right moment. And most disturbing of all, they seemed to be aware of being watched, of the hidden observers, even when those observers were completely concealed and silent. Several times, children would walk to the edge of the observation zone and stare directly at hidden cameras or watching officers, smiling that same unsettling smile that Douglas Hickman had seen 8 years earlier. Dr. Chen became obsessed with the case. She was a specialist in genetic disorders and had studied isolated populations around the world, but she had never encountered anything like the Merrows. She obtained genetic samples, hair, and skin cells collected from the abandoned farmhouse, and she submitted them to laboratories for analysis. The results were disturbing. The Merrow DNA showed the expected markers of inbreeding, the reduced genetic diversity, the concentration of recessive traits. But it also showed something else, mutations that had no obvious cause, changes to genes involved in neural development, in auditory processing, in the structure of the brain itself. These were not the random mutations that occur in all populations, but specific, directed changes, as if the genetic damage from inbreeding had triggered some kind of adaptive response, some mechanism that was rewriting the family's DNA in real time. Dr. Chen presented her findings at a closed conference of geneticists and neurologists, and the response was a mixture of fascination and skepticism. Some argued that her results must be contaminated, that such rapid, directed evolution was impossible in humans, that it violated everything we understood about how genetic change occurs. Others suggested that the Merrows represented an unknown syndrome, a form of genetic disorder that produced unusual brain structures capable of electromagnetic communication, or something similar. But no one could explain how 36 people could develop the same rare mutations, could exhibit the same impossible abilities, could function as what appeared to be a single distributed consciousness. The conference ended with more questions than answers, and Dr. Chen returned to Kentucky determined to conduct more extensive studies, but she never got the chance. In December 1979, a massive winter storm hit eastern Kentucky, dropping 3 feet of snow and bringing temperatures down to 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The observation posts were abandoned, deemed too dangerous to maintain in the extreme weather. When teams returned a week later, the Merrow camp was empty again. The family had moved deeper into the forest, into areas so remote and inaccessible that following them was deemed impossible. Search efforts were half-hearted, hampered by weather and a growing sense among the authorities that perhaps it was better to let the family go, to allow them to disappear into the wilderness where they seemed to belong. The case was officially closed in 1980. The family declared lost and presumed deceased, though there was no actual evidence of death, no bodies, no confirmation of any kind. But the story does not end there, because stories like this never truly end. They continue in whispers, in reports that are never officially filed, in encounters that are dismissed as hallucinations or hoaxes. In the 40 years since the Merrows vanished into the Kentucky wilderness, there have been dozens of reported sightings. Hikers who claim to have seen children in the deep forest, children who watched them with strange intensity before vanishing into the undergrowth. Hunters who report finding camps that appear and disappear, structures that are there one day and gone the next. Park rangers who swear they have heard voices in the woods, voices that speak without sound, that bypass the ears entirely and resonate inside the skull. Most of these reports are dismissed, filed away, and forgotten. But there are enough of them, from credible witnesses, that some researchers believe the Merrows not only survived but thrived, that they represent a new form of human, adapted to isolation, to silence, to a mode of existence we cannot fully understand. Dr. Chen continued her research until her death in 2015, and her private files, obtained by investigative journalists after her passing, reveal the depth of her obsession with the Merrow case. She believed that the family represented an evolutionary event, a demonstration that humans under extreme genetic stress could develop abilities that seemed supernatural, but were actually the result of unexpressed genetic potential. She theorized that the intensive inbreeding had activated ancient genes, dormant sequences of DNA that existed in all humans but were normally suppressed, genes that coded for forms of communication and perception that our ancestors possessed but that modern humans had lost. She speculated that the Merrows could potentially sense electromagnetic fields, could detect the bioelectric activity of other brains, could share sensory information and thoughts through mechanisms that had nothing to do with speech or sight or any conventional sense. Her most controversial theory, outlined in notes that were never published, suggested that the Merrows might be evolving into something that could no longer be classified as Homo sapiens, that they represented a divergent branch of humanity adapted for a specific ecological niche. She wrote that if left undisturbed for several more generations, the family might develop into a distinct species, unable to interbreed with normal humans, possessing cognitive and perceptual abilities so different that communication between them and us would become impossible. She called them Homo silentium, the silent people, and she argued that their existence raised profound questions about the nature of humanity, about the boundaries of our species, about what it means to be human when the fundamental ways we experience reality are transformed. Not everyone agreed with Dr. Chen's theories. Critics argued that she had allowed herself to become too invested in the case, that she was seeing patterns that did not exist, that she was ascribing supernatural abilities to people who were simply disabled and traumatized. They pointed out that many of the reported sightings were unverifiable, that the genetic evidence could be interpreted in multiple ways, that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence. The scientific establishment largely dismissed her work as fringe speculation, too contaminated by folklore and wishful thinking to be taken seriously. But her defenders, a small group of researchers who had worked with isolated populations and seen how quickly humans can adapt to extreme circumstances, argued that her theories deserved serious consideration, that the Merrow case represented something genuinely unprecedented that challenged our understanding of human potential and human limitations. In 2003, a research team from the University of Virginia attempted to locate the Merrows, using satellite imagery, thermal cameras, and advanced search techniques. They identified several potential sites deep in the wilderness, areas where human habitation seemed possible. They mounted an expedition, bringing anthropologists, linguists, and medical personnel, hoping to establish peaceful contact and conduct non-invasive studies. The expedition lasted 3 weeks and found nothing. No camps, no evidence of human presence, no trace of the family that had supposedly been living in those forests for over 30 years. The team concluded that the Merrows were either dead or had become so skilled at concealment that detection was impossible. Or, as one team member suggested in a report that was heavily redacted before publication, the family had learned to sense approaching search parties from miles away, and had developed the ability to avoid detection indefinitely. But then there are the children who have appeared in nearby towns over the years, children who match the age and description of potential Merrow descendants, children who appear in emergency rooms or at the edges of communities, silent and strange, who receive medical care and then vanish before social services can intervene. A girl found wandering near a highway in 1995, approximately 12 years old, who could not or would not speak, who reacted to no auditory stimuli, who was placed in foster care and disappeared from her bedroom 3 days later despite locked doors and windows on the second floor. A boy discovered in a Walmart parking lot in 2007, maybe 8, wearing handmade clothing, who bit a security guard who tried to restrain him and fled with inhuman speed into the surrounding forest. Twin infants abandoned at a hospital in 2019, healthy despite apparent neglect, who the nurses swore they could hear crying even when both babies were sound asleep and silent. These incidents, scattered across decades, are officially unconnected. There is no evidence linking them to the Merrow family, no DNA matches, no fingerprints, nothing that would stand up in court or scientific peer review. But researchers who study isolated populations, who track anomalous cases, who maintain databases of unexplained phenomena, they see patterns. They note that all of these children appeared in counties within 100 miles of where the Merrows disappeared. They observe that all exhibited the same strange deafness, the same unusual abilities, the same tendency to vanish when authorities became involved. They wonder if these children represent a third or fourth generation, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the original 30. If the family has grown to 50 or 70 or 100 members, all living in the vast wilderness of Appalachia, all connected by bonds we cannot perceive, all existing in a reality parallel to ours but fundamentally separate. The ethical questions surrounding the Merrow case are complex and unresolved. Do we have an obligation to find these people, to offer them medical care, education, integration into society? Or do they have a right to be left alone, to live as they choose, to develop in their own way without interference? Are they victims who need rescue, or are they a sovereign group with their own culture and their own path? Different experts give different answers. Some argue that the children especially deserve protection, that growing up in isolation without access to education or health care is a violation of their rights. Others counter that imposing our values on a group that has explicitly rejected contact is a form of colonialism, that we have no right to force our way of life on people who have chosen differently. Still, others suggest that the question is moot, that the Merrows have become so adapted to their existence that they could not successfully integrate into normal society even if they wanted to, that the gulf between their reality and ours has grown too wide to bridge. In the sealed archives of the Kentucky State Police, there is a file that is updated periodically with new reports, new sightings, new pieces of the puzzle. The file is classified not because it contains state secrets, but because authorities genuinely do not know what to do with the information it contains, how to respond to a situation that has no precedent, no clear legal framework, no obvious solution. The file contains testimonies from people who claim to have encountered the Merrows, photographs that show blurred figures in deep forest, audio recordings of sounds that should not exist. One recording, made by a park ranger in 2012, captures what sounds like children singing, but the sound has unusual properties, frequencies that standard equipment struggles to record, harmonics that seem to resonate at the edge of perception. Analysis of the recording suggests it might not be vocal at all, but rather some form of electromagnetic phenomenon, radio waves or something similar being generated by biological sources. The most disturbing entry in the file is from 2018, a report filed by a helicopter pilot who was conducting a wildlife survey over remote forest. The pilot, an experienced aviator with thousands of flight hours, claims that his instruments malfunctioned when flying over a particular valley, that his radio filled with static, and his GPS showed impossible readings. He descended to investigate and saw, through a gap in the canopy, what appeared to be a gathering of people, dozens of them, standing in a clearing in perfect silence. They all looked up at the helicopter simultaneously, and the pilot reports feeling a sensation he described as pressure inside his head, as if something was trying to communicate with him, trying to push information into his mind that his brain could not process. He experienced sudden vertigo, lost control of the helicopter briefly, and had to execute an emergency landing. By the time he had composed himself and returned to the area, the clearing was empty. The pilot refused to fly over that region again and eventually transferred to a different district. His report was filed and classified, one more strange piece of a puzzle that no one can solve. There are theories, dozens of them, ranging from the scientific to the supernatural. Some researchers believe the Merrows represent a genuine case of rapid human evolution, that genetic stress combined with isolation triggered dormant abilities. Others think the family suffers from a shared delusion, a form of folly, a familial mass psychosis that creates the illusion of telepathic communication. Paranormal investigators claim the family has made contact with something inhuman, that living in those deep forests has exposed them to entities or energies that have transformed them. Religious fundamentalists see them as either blessed or cursed, depending on theological perspective, either chosen by God for special purpose or contaminated by demonic influence. Conspiracy theorists suggest government experiments, secret projects, genetic engineering gone wrong. The truth, if there is a singular truth, remains elusive. What we know for certain is limited. We know that a family lived in isolation for decades, engaging in practices that violated both law and biological wisdom. We know that they produced children who exhibited unusual traits, who seemed to communicate in ways that defied conventional understanding. We know that when authorities attempted to intervene, the family disappeared into wilderness and has remained hidden for over 40 years. We know that there are periodic reports of encounters, of sightings, of strange phenomena in the forests where they vanished. Beyond that, we enter the realm of speculation, of theory, of belief rather than knowledge. The Merrows have become a modern legend, a story that is told around campfires and discussed in late-night conversations. A mystery that combines elements of true crime, medical anomaly, and supernatural folklore. For the people of Harrow's Creek and the surrounding communities, the Merrows are a presence that never quite goes away. Parents tell children not to wander too deep into the woods, not because of bears or getting lost, but because of the silent people who live there, who watch from the shadows, who can hear your thoughts if you get too close. Hunters report areas of the forest that feel wrong, where the normal sounds of wildlife cease, where the air seems heavy and oppressive, where they experience inexplicable fear that drives them back towards civilization. Some locals claim to have left offerings at the edges of the deep forest, food or tools or clothing, offerings that disappear overnight. though whether taken by the Merrows or by animals is impossible to know. There is a sense in these communities that the family represents something that should be left alone, that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed, that some knowledge comes with prices too high to pay. The Merrow farmhouse still stands, though barely. It has become a destination for urban explorers and paranormal investigators, people who ignore the no trespassing signs and venture onto the property to document the decay, to search for evidence, to experience whatever strange energy supposedly lingers there. Most leave disappointed, finding only an old house falling apart, nothing supernatural or unusual, but some report experiences that echo the original testimonies from 1971. They hear voices inside their heads, whispers in languages they don't understand. They feel watched, observed by invisible eyes. They experience sudden terror that sends them fleeing back to their cars. Photographs taken inside the house sometimes show anomalies, orbs of light, shadow figures, faces in windows that should be empty. Skeptics dismiss these as tricks of light, dust on lenses, the power of suggestion. Believers see them as evidence that the Merrows left something behind, some residue of their presence, some echo of what they became. Dr. Chen, before her death, established a foundation dedicated to studying isolated populations and unusual genetic phenomena. The Chen Foundation continues her work, monitoring reports, collecting data, searching for patterns. They maintain the largest database of Merrow-related information, hundreds of reports spanning decades, and they use advanced analysis to try to determine what is signal and what is noise, what represents genuine evidence and what is folklore or hoax. Their preliminary findings, published in obscure academic journals, suggest that something real happened to the Merrow family, that the testimonies from credible witnesses like Patricia Holbrook and Dr. Chen herself cannot be easily dismissed, but they also acknowledge the limitations of studying a subject that refuses to be studied, that actively avoids detection, that exists in the margins between documented reality and legend. The question that haunts researchers is simple but profound. What has become of the Merrow family by now? If they have survived these 40 years, if they have continued to reproduce and adapt, what are they now? Are they still human in any meaningful sense? Or have they diverged so far that they represent something new, something we have no name for? If you could encounter them today, could you communicate with them at all? Or would the gulf be unbridgeable? And if they have developed abilities that seem impossible, if they truly can share thoughts and perceptions across distances, if they truly exist as a kind of collective consciousness distributed across multiple bodies, what does that mean for our understanding of consciousness itself, of boundaries between individuals, of what it means to be a person rather than part of a larger whole? These are not just academic questions. They touch on fundamental issues of identity, autonomy, and the nature of human experience. The Merrows challenge our assumptions about what humans can become, about the limits of adaptation, about the price we pay for isolation. They represent a path not taken, a divergence from the mainstream of human development, and whether that path leads to something transcendent or to tragedy remains unknown. Some see them as tragic victims of circumstance, people who deserve compassion and help. Others see them as harbingers of possibility, demonstrations that humans contain potentials we have barely begun to understand. Still others see them as warnings, examples of what happens when we abandon the social bonds and genetic diversity that make us human, when we retreat so far into ourselves that we lose connection with the larger human family. The forest keeps its secrets. The wilderness of eastern Kentucky is vast, over 1 million acres of rugged terrain, much of it inaccessible by road, some of it never fully mapped or explored. In that vastness, a family could hide indefinitely, could build a life invisible to satellites and search parties, could exist in a parallel world that touches ours but rarely intersects. And perhaps that is where the Merrows remain, deep in caves and hollows, raising new generations in silence, adapting further with each passing year, becoming something we can no longer recognize. Perhaps they watch us, monitor our technology, our cities, our noisy, complicated lives, and feel relief that they escaped, that they found a different path. Or perhaps they are gone, claimed by disease or accident or the simple mathematics of a small gene pool, and the sightings are just shadows, tricks of light and mind, our need to believe in mysteries giving form to nothing. The truth, if we ever discover it, will likely be stranger than any theory we have constructed. The human story is full of surprises, of capabilities and catastrophes we never predicted. The Merrows, whether they exist as described, or have become something else entirely, or are nothing more than legend, represent a chapter of that story that we have barely begun to understand. They remind us that the boundaries of human possibility are wider than we imagine, that isolation and pressure can produce transformations both beautiful and terrible, that the line between human and something else is perhaps more permeable than we like to believe. And they remind us that some mysteries may be unsolvable, that some questions may have no answers we can access, that the universe contains spaces where our knowledge cannot reach, and our understanding fails. In the darkness of the forest, in the silence that is not quite silence, the Merrows wait, if they wait at all, and we can only wonder what they have become, and what they might teach us about ourselves, if we ever learn to hear them.